She had 3 months to live when he asked her to marry him. No, that's not right. She asked him. On a Tuesday evening, sitting on her porch with oxygen tubes running from her nose, she looked at the man she barely knew and said, "I need you to marry me before I die." He should have said no. Any rational person would have. But there was something in her eyes that night, something that made him feel like refusing would haunt him forever. 2 weeks later, they stood in a courthouse with no witnesses, no flowers, no family. Just a judge who looked uncomfortable and two strangers who became husband and wife in less than 10 minutes. That night, as he helped her back into her house, she squeezed his hand and whispered, "Thank you for saving my life." He didn't understand what she meant. Not then, but he would. And when he did, it would change everything he thought he knew about kindness, about sacrifice, and about the secrets people take to their graves. Before we dive deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And if you're new here, click on the subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. The marriage certificate sat on Michael's kitchen table for 3 days before he actually looked at it. His name next to hers, Catherine Walsh, legally binding them until death, which, according to her doctors, would be sometime in early spring. He'd gone into this with open eyes, or so he thought. An act of compassion for a dying woman who needed something he could provide. Simple, clean, temporary. But things started feeling wrong almost immediately. The day after the wedding, a man in an expensive suit knocked on Catherine's door. Michael watched from his window as she refused to let him in, her frail body somehow radiating defiance. The man left an envelope on her doorstep. She burned it without opening it. Then there was the locked room upstairs in her house, the one she asked him never to enter. And the way her phone would ring at odd hours, calls she never answered, but that left her shaking and pale. Michael told himself it wasn't his business. They'd made an arrangement, nothing more. But late at night, lying in his own bed across the fence from hers, he couldn't shake the feeling that by saying yes to her request, he'd stepped into something far bigger than a dying woman's final wish. Michael Chin had lived a quiet life by design. At 42, he'd perfected the art of being unremarkable. He worked as an accountant for a mid-sized firm, kept his lawn trimmed, and had exactly 3 friends he saw once a month for poker. His ex-wife had left him 6 years earlier, tired of what she called his emotional unavailability, which was her way of saying he preferred silence to conflict and solitude to vulnerability. He'd loved her, in his way, but not enough to fight when she packed her bags. Since then, his life had been peaceful, predictable, safe. Catherine had moved in next door about 8 months ago, though he didn't learn her name until she'd been there 3 months. She was in her late 50s, he guessed, with graying hair she wore in a practical bun and a wariness in her eyes that suggested she'd learned not to trust easily. They exchanged the usual neighbor pleasantries, but nothing more until the day he found her collapsed in her driveway. The ambulance came. She spent a week in the hospital. When she came home, everything was different. She had a hospice nurse who visited twice a week. Medical equipment cluttered her living room, and she moved slower, more carefully, like someone negotiating with a body that was actively betraying her. Michael started checking on her. Small things at first, bringing in her mail, taking out her trash on collection days. Then bigger things, driving her to appointments when the nurse couldn't, picking up prescriptions, sitting with her on the porch in the evenings when the pain medication made her too restless to sleep. They talked during those evenings. Real conversations, not the surface-level exchanges of polite strangers. She told him about her career as a social worker, about cases that had broken her heart and kids she still thought about decades later. He told her about his marriage, about the loneliness he'd convinced himself was contentment. She never mentioned family, and he never asked. Some silences felt too deliberate to break. Then one evening in October, with autumn leaves swirling around the porch and the smell of wood smoke in the air, she said, "I need to ask you something, and I need you to really think before you answer." She explained it carefully, methodically. She needed to be married before she died. It had to be legal. It had to be soon. She couldn't tell him why, not all of it, but she promised it wouldn't cost him anything. No financial obligation. No expectation beyond the ceremony itself. When she was gone, he'd be free. "I know it's strange," she said. "I know I have no right to ask, but I wouldn't ask if there was any other way." Michael sat there, watching her hands tremble in her lap, seeing the fear she was trying to hide. and found himself saying yes before he'd fully processed the question. Because in that moment, it seemed like the only decent thing to do. How could he refuse a dying woman her final request? What kind of person would that make him? He told himself it was simple kindness. An inconvenience, yes, but a small one in the grand scheme of things. He had no idea that kindness would become the most complicated thing he'd ever done. The courthouse wedding was awkward in the way these things always are when stripped of sentiment. The judge, a tired-looking woman in her 60s, processed them with the same efficiency she'd probably used for dozens of couples that week. She asked the required questions. They gave the required answers. Catherine's hand was cold when Michael slipped the simple gold band on her finger, one they'd picked up at a pawn shop that morning. The whole thing took 9 minutes. They were married. The drive home was quiet. Catherine fell asleep in the passenger seat, exhausted from the short outing. Michael carried her prescriptions and the marriage certificate, feeling the weight of what he'd done settling into his chest. That evening, he heated up soup and brought it to her. She was sitting up in bed, looking more alert than she had all day. "There's something you should know," she said. "Things might get complicated. People might come asking questions. If anyone asks, we've known each other for 2 years. We fell in love. The marriage was my idea, but you agreed because you love me. Can you remember that?" The specificity of it made his stomach turn. "Catherine, what's going on? I can't tell you everything. Not yet. Maybe not ever. But I need you to trust that this was necessary. Please, Michael, just trust me." He wanted to push, demand answers. But she looked so fragile sitting there, and he'd already made his choice. So he nodded and left her to rest. The first visitor came 3 days later. The man in the expensive suit with cold eyes and a smile that didn't reach them. Michael answered the door, and the man introduced himself as Richard Voss, an attorney. "I'm looking for Mrs. Walsh," he said. "Or should I say Mrs. Chun now? Congratulations on the marriage." There was something mocking in his tone. Michael felt his defenses rise. "She's resting. She's not well. I'm aware of her condition. That's actually why I'm here. There are some legal matters that need to be addressed before she becomes incapacitated. Time-sensitive matters. She's not seeing visitors. If you have legal business, you can leave your information, and she'll contact you when she's able." Richard Voss's smile thinned. "I don't think you understand the situation, Mr. Chun. This isn't optional. Mrs. Walsh has obligations. Documents she needs to sign. Property that needs to be transferred. Her marriage to you complicates things considerably. How would you even know about the marriage?" Michael stopped, realizing what he'd almost revealed. Voss's smile widened. "Public records, Mr. Chun. Marriage certificates are public documents. I make it my business to stay informed about my client's activities. She's not your client anymore if she doesn't want to be. It's not quite that simple. But I can see you're determined to be difficult. Tell Catherine that her family is very concerned about her well-being. We'd hate for anything unfortunate to happen during this difficult time, especially to those she cares about." The threat was barely veiled. Michael felt anger flash through him, cutting through his confusion. "I think you should leave. Now." Richard Voss handed him a business card. "Have her call me. Soon. Before decisions get made for her." Michael watched him drive away in a black sedan, then went straight to Catherine's room. She was awake, staring at the ceiling with tears running down her temples. "He came, didn't he?" she whispered. "Who is he? What does he want?" "He wants me to undo something I did a long time ago. Something I can't undo." "Catherine, you have to tell me what's happening. If I'm going to help you, you're already helping. By being my husband. That's all I need. Please, Michael, don't ask for more than I can give." But it was too late for that. Michael was already in too deep to pretend this was simple. That night, he started searching. Catherine Walsh. Richard Voss. Any connection he could find. What he discovered would make him question everything. Over the next 2 weeks, Michael became someone he didn't recognize. He'd always been the type to follow rules, avoid conflict, stay in his lane. Now he was lying to attorneys, ignoring threatening phone calls, and spending his evenings digging through public records and news archives. What he found about Catherine painted a picture that didn't match the quiet, dying woman next door. 23 years ago, she'd been involved in a high-profile case. A wealthy family, the Vanderbilts, had their teenage daughter removed from their custody after evidence of severe abuse. Catherine had been the social worker who'd built the case, who'd testified in court, who'd made sure that girl was placed somewhere safe. The family had been furious. They'd sued. They'd threatened. They'd used their considerable resources to make Catherine's life hell. She'd eventually left social work entirely, moved to a different state, started over. But apparently, they hadn't forgotten. And apparently, there was property involved. The Vanderbilts' estate, worth millions, was set to be divided. And according to some obscure legal clause Michael didn't fully understand, Catherine had a claim to a portion of it. Compensation for damages, maybe, or restitution for the hell they'd put her through. The articles weren't clear, and Catherine wouldn't explain. What Michael did understand was that if Catherine died unmarried, that claim would dissolve. But if she was married, her spouse would inherit the claim, which meant by marrying her, Michael had become an obstacle to the Vanderbilt family getting their full inheritance. He confronted her on a Friday evening, his research printed out and stacked on her nightstand. "You used me," he said, not angry but stunned. "You knew what would happen. You knew they'd come after me." Catherine was having a bad day. The hospice nurse had increased her pain medication, and she drifted in and out of clarity. But when she looked at him, her eyes were sharp. "I gave you an out before we married. I told you things might get complicated. You didn't tell me I'd inherit a legal battle with a family of millionaires. You didn't tell me I'd be getting threats. You didn't tell me. I didn't tell you because you would have said no. And I was desperate." Her voice cracked. "They've been circling me for months, Michael. Waiting for me to die so they can bury the whole thing. Bury what they did to that girl. Bury the evidence that might still come out. If I die alone, they win. They get their money. Their reputation stays intact. And Sarah." She stopped, pressing a hand to her mouth. "Sarah? The girl I saved. She's a woman now. She has kids. She built a life. And if they can erase what happened, they'll try to come after her too. Discredit her. Silence her. I couldn't let that happen." Michael sat down slowly. "So this isn't about money. It was never about money. It's about making sure someone remembers. Someone who can't be bullied or bought or threatened into forgetting." The anger drained out of him, replaced by something more complicated. Fear, yes, but also understanding. Catherine hadn't used him. She'd trusted him, with something bigger than either of them. "What happens now?" he asked. "Now you decide if you're still willing to be my husband. Really be my husband. Because this fight doesn't end when I die, Michael. It's just beginning." He should have walked away. Any rational person would have. But as he looked at this dying woman who'd spent her life protecting people who couldn't protect themselves, he realized that walking away would make him someone he didn't want to be. "Tell me what I need to do," he said. Catherine smiled, the first genuine smile he'd seen from her in weeks. "Just stay? That's all. Just stay." The next 3 weeks were a blur of legal meetings, document reviews, and increasingly hostile messages from the Vanderbilt family's lawyers. Michael learned more about estate law than he'd ever wanted to know. He learned that Catherine's claim was solid but complicated, that it would take years to resolve, that the family would fight every step of the way. But he also learned about Sarah. Catherine finally told him the whole story one evening, her voice weak but determined. The cigarette burns on a 12-year-old's arms. The broken bones explained away as clumsiness. The private school that turned a blind eye because of donation money. Catherine had seen it during a routine home visit. She'd documented it. She'd fought for that girl when everyone else was willing to look away. And she'd won. Sarah had been placed with foster parents who actually loved her. She'd graduated high school, gone to college, become a teacher. She had 2 kids now. A good life. A safe life. "I got a letter from her last month," Catherine whispered. "She heard I was sick. She wanted to thank me. Said I saved her life." Tears rolled down her cheeks. "She doesn't know about the legal stuff. The claim. I never told her. I didn't want her to feel obligated. But if I can make sure the Vanderbilts never have the power to hurt anyone else, if I can make sure people know what they did, that feels like finishing something important." Michael found himself holding her hand. Somewhere along the way, this had stopped being an arrangement. He cared about this woman, about her fight, about making sure her last act mattered. "We'll make sure people know," he promised. "I'll make sure." Catherine squeezed his hand weakly. "I'm sorry I got you into this." "I'm not," he said, and he meant it. Catherine died on a Tuesday morning in February, 3 weeks longer than her doctors had predicted. Michael was with her. He'd spent the night in the chair beside her bed because the hospice nurse said it would be soon. She'd been unconscious for 2 days, her breathing shallow and irregular. He held her hand and talked to her, not sure if she could hear, but unable to sit in silence. He told her about the lawyer he'd hired, about the strategy they were building, about how Sarah's testimony, if needed, would be protected, how the truth would come out. At 6:47 a.m., her breathing stopped. Just stopped, in the middle of an exhale. The stillness was profound. Michael sat there for a long time, still holding her hand, feeling the weight of promises and grief, and something that might have been love if they'd had more time. The funeral was small. Michael, the hospice nurse, and 3 former colleagues from Catherine's social work days. No family, no Vanderbilts, just people who understood what she'd fought for. The revelation came a week later when Catherine's actual will was read. Michael sat in a lawyer's office, expecting to learn about the property claim, the legal battle ahead. Instead, he learned the truth. The Vanderbilt claim was real. The fight was real. But Catherine had already won. 6 months before her diagnosis, she'd quietly settled the case. The Vanderbilts, facing new evidence and the possibility of public exposure, had agreed to pay a substantial sum to a foundation in Sarah's name. A foundation dedicated to protecting children from abuse. Catherine had used every penny to establish it, to hire staff, to create something that would outlast her. The claim Michael had inherited was real, but it wasn't about money. It was about control. By being married, Michael now sat on the foundation's board. He had voting power. He had access to the records. He had the ability to make sure the foundation continued its work and the Vanderbilts could never dismantle it from within. Catherine's lawyer, a kind-faced woman named Patricia, smiled softly. She knew you'd do it right. She told me you were the kind of man who'd see this through not for money, but because it mattered. She was right, wasn't she? Michael sat there, stunned. Catherine hadn't trapped him. She'd chosen him. Carefully. Deliberately. Because she'd seen something in him that he hadn't seen in himself. The willingness to fight for something bigger than his own comfort. There's one more thing, Patricia said, sliding an envelope across the desk. She wrote this for you. Asked me to give it to you after. Michael opened it with shaking hands. Catherine's handwriting, shaky but clear. Michael, I'm sorry I couldn't tell you everything. I'm sorry I asked so much of you. But I knew from the first conversation on the porch that you were someone who understood what it meant to show up for people. Not because it's easy. Not because there's something in it for you. But because it's right. You gave me the most precious gift anyone could give a dying woman. Not pity. Not charity. But partnership. You stood beside me when you could have walked away. You made my last fight mean something. Thank you for being the man I knew you were. Thank you for saving my life in the way that actually mattered. I hope you find someone to build a real life with, Michael. You deserve that. But until you do, you have a purpose. You have kids who need protecting and a foundation that will make sure people like Sarah get the chance I fought to give her. I couldn't think of better hands to leave it in. With love and gratitude, Catherine. Michael read it 3 times, tears blurring the words. He'd thought he was doing her a favor. In reality, she'd done one for him. She'd given his quiet, careful life meaning. She'd shown him what it felt like to matter. In the months that followed, Michael threw himself into the foundation's work. He learned about child protective services. He attended meetings with social workers. He read case files that broke his heart and reminded him why Catherine had fought so hard. The Vanderbilts made one attempt to challenge his board position, claiming the marriage had been fraudulent. But between the marriage certificate, the witnesses who'd seen them together, and Catherine's clear documentation of her wishes, they had no case. They backed off. The foundation grew. Sarah visited once, bringing her children. She wanted to see the man who'd stood by Catherine at the end. They sat in Catherine's old house, which Michael had kept, unable to sell it. Sarah told him stories about Catherine he'd never heard. How she'd visited every year on Sarah's birthday, even after the case was closed. How she'd helped pay for college. How she'd been at Sarah's wedding, crying in the back row. She never wanted recognition, Sarah said. She just wanted to know we were okay. That we were safe. She gave me my life back. She gave me something too, Michael said quietly. Purpose, I think. Or maybe just the courage to care about something more than my own comfort. Michael started dating again a year later. A woman named Jennifer who worked at the foundation as a case manager. She understood the work. She understood why it mattered. They took it slow, learning each other carefully. On what would have been Catherine's 60th birthday, Michael visited her grave. He brought flowers and sat in the grass, talking to her like he had on those porch evenings. I think you knew what you were doing, he said to the headstone. Choosing me. I think you saw I needed this as much as you needed me. Thank you for that. For seeing me when I'd spent so long trying to be invisible. The wind rustled through the cemetery trees. Michael sat in the quiet, feeling connected to something larger than himself. The foundation had helped 63 children in its first year. 63 kids who might have fallen through the cracks. Catherine's legacy, growing and spreading. But more than that, Michael's own life had expanded in ways he couldn't have imagined. He had purpose. He had connection. He had proof that showing up for people, even when it's complicated and messy and scary, could change everything. He thought about the man he'd been 2 years ago. Quiet, safe, alone. That man would have said no to Catherine's request, would have protected himself from the complexity, and in doing so, would have missed out on the most meaningful experience of his life. Sometimes the smallest yes, given at the right moment, reshapes everything. So here's the question we want to leave you with. What would you have done if your dying neighbor asked you to marry them, knowing it would complicate your life, but might save something important? Would you have said yes? Could you have walked into that uncertainty, trusted someone you barely knew, and let your quiet life become something bigger and messier and more meaningful? Share your thoughts in the comments. We'd love to hear how you would have handled this impossible choice. Because the truth is, most of us will never face exactly this situation. But we all face moments where we have to choose between safety and significance, between protecting ourselves and showing up for someone else. Catherine and Michael's story reminds us that sometimes the most important thing we can do is say yes when every rational part of us wants to say no. If this story moved you, if it made you think differently about kindness and sacrifice and the ways we show up for each other, please subscribe. We share stories like this every week. Stories about ordinary people making extraordinary choices, about the moments that define us and the legacies we leave behind. Because the next story we tell might just change the way you see your own life. Thank you for watching. And remember, sometimes saving someone else's life is how you find your own.